Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this morning's Dukefield Procurement webinar on the subject of the Procurement Act 2023, most specifically what's new in that context. And the webinar this morning is being presented by our friends and colleagues at the Forbes Solicitors. Next slide, please. So my name is Steve Davis. I'm Director of Procurement at Dukefield Procurement. And Dukefield Procurement are a procurement consultancy who have been providing procurement support services to the education sector now for well over 25 years. So we're quite experienced in supporting all manner of education establishments in that regard. We're part of the wider Dukefield Group, and the Dukefield Group of companies are a four-strong group of organisations, all providing a wide basket of supplies and services to the public sector in that regard. Dukefield Procurement are the contract managers for the CPC Legal Services Framework, which is a compliance framework accessible by all public sector organisations. And it provides access to a full suite of legal services across 7 lots. Including a one-stop shop, 5, I suppose, targeted specialist legal services area lots, and 1 specific education lot. And Forbes Solicitors are one of our key suppliers on the CPC Legal Services Framework. So if you want to engage with Forbes Solicitors, then of course the CPC Legal Services Framework is the ideal route to engage with them in a compliant manner. I'll now hand over to Forbes for the main body of the presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So my name's Gemma Duxbury. I'm a partner here at Forbes in the commercial public sector team, and I'm joined by my very knowledgeable colleague who I nicknamed the Oracle, Daniel Milnes, just looking for somebody else, who is an expert in this particular area of law on which I support him on. So we're going to be looking at the Procurement Act 2023. As you are aware, this was due to be sort of coming into place in October, but actually was pushed back to February. So there's been a lot happening with regards to this in some respects, but in other respects, there hasn't been much happening. But hopefully we'll be able to give you a bit of an update as to where things are. So firstly, we'd just like to, as we are lawyers, we have to have the typical disclaimer in there and say that this isn't specific advice. And please be aware that obviously this is just for training purposes and has been shortened and is quite brief. So please do not take this as legal advice. We are just here to give you some training on the legislation itself. We wouldn't be lawyers if we didn't have a disclaimer in there, would we? So please do bear that in mind. So what are we actually going to look at today? So the Procurement Act itself, why there's been a change, what's new, what's going to change the way that we've been working for the last few years, how this relates specifically to schools and the education system, why we care about it and why we need to be aware of it. And then towards the end, hopefully we will have some time for some questions. So firstly, as you can see here, we're going to talk about why there's been this change, and I'm going to hand over to Dan to take over from here.
Thank you, Gemma. Good morning, everyone. So that is the question. Why bother changing this at all? We all knew and loved the procurement regulations as they were, the Public Contract Regulations 2015, Concession Contracts Regulations 2016. We all knew where we stood. Why change it all now? And certainly why change it all in a way that still looks very broadly like it used to, but with some new features? Well, if you practice in the areas of public sector law and education, as Gemma and I do, and also in data protection, there's been quite a lot of changing things for new names since about, let's say, 2018. And it isn't all quite as different as people would sometimes have you believe, but you've got to be able to know what's changed. So why change it in the first place? Well, allegedly to simplify it, and I'm putting a big asterisk on that. You tell me at the end whether you think this is any simpler than it used to be. And there are bits of it that are supposed to be, but not without unintended consequences, I think, in our assessment. There's some more flexibility, and that is absolutely true. And we're going to come back to that later. Flexibility you definitely have. The question is, with 11 days to go, have you decided what to do with that flexibility? And transparency. And we're coming in a minute to what transparency actually translates to under the new Procurement Act and procurement regulations. However, it's worth having a look there very quickly at the text of Section 12, subsection 1 from the Procurement Act. Covered procurement is a public contract, as you would know it. So a covered procurement is any procurement to which the Act and regulations apply. So the contracting authority must have regard to the importance of these four things. So value for money and maximising public benefit. Well, I think you all thought you were doing that to begin with. C is the big new part, sharing information for the purpose of allowing suppliers and others to understand the authority's procurement policies and decisions. To what end, you might wonder, would we want to be sharing all of this information? Is it perhaps so that unsuccessful bidders can sadly reconcile themselves to the wisdom of your decision? Or is it so that they can decide whether or not they want to argue the toss about the result? Well, you'll have to make up your own mind, but certainly unsuccessful bidders are going to be getting an awful lot more information than they used to. And I will leave it up to you to decide what they might or might not choose to do with it when they get it. So let's take a look at how the change is going to happen, because it's worth bearing in mind that the Public Contracts Regulations 2015 and the Concession Contracts Regulations 16 are not going to disappear. On the 24th of this month, they do not become irrelevant. If you've got a copy, do not burn it like your lecture notes at the end of the course. Hang on to it. You are still going to need it. And that is because the rules are set up in this way. There is a line in the sand set out by the commencement number 3 regulations. And the line in the sand is any procurement that has started before 1 minute past midnight on the 24th of February is going to be done under the old rules, the current rules as we have them now. So they will apply to all procurements that have already happened and all procurements that have started. So if you start now, you can run your procurement under the PCR 2015, make your award under the PCR 15, and carry on as if nothing had changed. Apart from a couple of very slight modifications down at the bottom of the slide there, which is to do with if you started a new dynamic purchasing system just before the changeover, it's only going to be allowed to run for 4 more years. And if you're repeating direct orders by extending existing contracts, the new rules apply with a little bit of modification. So if it's a one-off procurement that started under the old rules, it runs under the old rules, stops, and then your re-procurement will be under the new legislation. And that's generally what will be happening to most people. So if you want to be working under the current rules for a little bit longer, you can do that, but you've really got to get your skates on now because you've only got 11 days left. So what is actually new? Once we get past the 23rd, what will actually be different and how is that going to make any change in the way that you practice procurement? Well, here is the first thing. The first big change is how public procurement is going to look and feel if you're involved in it. And that is all to do with a very significant increase in the extent of publicity that contracting authorities will have to create. It quite literally A to Z. There are 26 different things, and that is lifted straight from the Procurement Regulations 2024. So pleased to say, we haven't had to compile this list. We've just snipped it and dumped it in the slide. But all of those things will have to be published on what is called the Central Digital Platform, which is essentially the find a tender service with upgrades. And we'll be talking about a few more of those as we go along. But look at the scope of this. It historically used to be the case that you would have a contract notice, you'd have an award notice, and that'd be about it. And then it would finish, and then you'd start again. You will simply not be able to do it with that small a number of notices in the vast majority of cases. So of those notices, which are the ones that we are particularly interested in talking about today? Well, let's try, if we can, to follow the life cycle of a procurement and a contract. So preliminary market engagement. This is one of the things that has been formalized under the new legislation. Previously, you were allowed to do preliminary market engagement, but you were doing it outside the public contracts regulations before they came into play. Now it's been brought into the fold. And if you're going to do preliminary market engagement, which can still be a very good idea and can still save you a lot of time and money in some cases, you need to publish a notice on the central digital platform to say you're going to do it, or you have to publish a notice to say that you did it and how it was done, so that everybody who didn't get involved in it has the opportunity to know that you did do it. Contract award notices are going to be very significantly different when we come to the end of the process. We'll talk a little bit later about how the timing of standstill works in relation to those notices, but most importantly, for a contract over £5 million, so any significant building project, any very long-term services contracts, certainly frameworks, you will have to publish all manner of information, including, for smaller contracts, how many unsuccessful bidders there were. But for those larger contracts over 5 million, you actually have to list the unsuccessful bidders whose tenders were assessed and were not awarded the contract. Now, nobody particularly likes being publicly named as a loser. However, think about that. What you will have now is all the people who bid and didn't win will be given each other's addresses and contact details, presumably so they can organise some kind of group therapy to help themselves feel better, and not so that they can club together and decide whether they want to have a pop at the winner and the contracting authority. So great bragging rights if you are the winner, because you get to find out who you beat. On the other hand, if it's the other way around, everybody gets to know who did better than you. So it might be the case that you find bidders who get the feeling they're not going to win trying to get out of the process before the final assessment, because it's, I think, only those who go all the way through to the final assessment who have to be listed as losing bidders. So when we talk about flexibility, one of the things you might want to consider is, are you going to offer bidders a way out partway through the process so they don't end up on that list? Key performance indicators. Everybody loves a KPI until you're having to compile swathes and swathes of management information to satisfy them. But they're still a good idea, still worth doing, particularly if you're the contracting authority. There is a presumption in the Procurement Act and the procurement regulations that you are going to pick and publicise at least 3 KPIs for every contract. If you do not do so, you must publish in one of the notices a reason why you did not consider that the contract was one capable of being measured by KPIs. And once you've set your KPIs and you have published a contract details notice, and for contracts over 5 million, you've actually published the contract itself, you then start having to deal with ongoing compliance notices during the life of the contract, which is not a thing that we have had under the current regulations. So we've got payment compliance notices, see later for limited exemptions to those. We've got contract performance notices. So at least once a year, you have to report against the KPIs as to how all the contractors on your contract are doing. And you have to, and stop me for anybody in education if this sounds a bit familiar, you have a prescribed scale, very like the old form of Ofsted report. There is no outstanding. There is effectively, there's all right, and then 3 different shades of not very good, grading all the way down to really not very good. And then there's a final category of can't be assessed. So again, previously, under the current regulations, if you had an underperforming contractor, you could get them in a quiet room, give them the hard word, threaten them with being terminated from the contract, and hope that their performance improved. But nobody would have to know that it had happened. If you've got somebody now who is defaulting on the KPI requirements, that is going to be published on the central digital platform for everybody to see. So we'll talk again at the end of the presentation about where are the tactics in this. Coming up on reporting time could be a good point to be chatting to your suppliers about what they're thinking about pricing for next year. If you've got a breach of contract or a positive failure to perform, there's also an obligation to start reporting that. That then can start to turn into exclusion from future contracts or future bidding opportunities. Contract change notices. So this is under what's now Schedule 8, what used to be known and loved as Regulation 72, the extent to which you can change an existing contract before it becomes a new contract. Contract change notices will have to be published when you make a change, apart from the most minor of changes. And contract termination notices, which you never had to do before. So contract termination notices are quite significant because it also means you can't quietly get rid of a contractor by agreeing to terminate the contract. You will have to publish a notice to say the contract is finished. You can state the reason, you can say that you didn't hold the contractor in breach, but everybody will know it finished early. So this blaze of publicity that's coming in really does change how you have to think about what you can or can't do behind the scenes anymore. And another feature of the central digital platform is there's going to be some lists on it. For anybody who hasn't actually seen Bouncers, it's a brilliant play, really funny. If it's on anywhere near you, go and see it. Strong recommendation, 5 stars. But there is core supplier information that has to be uploaded onto the central digital platform, and those uploads start at 1 minute past midnight on the 24th. And you have to put in quite a lot of information. There's the basic information, economic and financial standing information, connected persons information, and exclusion grounds information. Now, all of this is basically what you would get the bidders to fill in the selection questionnaire stage. So what they're going to do is upload all of that information to the central digital platform. And if you're running an open or a competitive flexible procedure or even a direct award under the new legislation, the supplier information must be on the platform and the supplier must use the platform to share that information with you as part of the bidding process. So you don't need to be asking for it. They have to have registered it centrally and send it to you from there. So you know you're getting the information that's also on the central record and not a tailored version or something with bits left out. So notice exclusion grounds information for both mandatory and discretionary exclusion. So that's got to be put there up front by the supplier. So potentially less hassle for you. It'll be coming in consistent formats. You should know what you're getting. And we'll see how that website plays when everybody tries to register in a couple of weeks' time. And here's the list you really don't want to have your name on. This is the new thing, the debarment list. And people have asked us over the years, well, it's okay, I can exclude suppliers for various things, including having breached a previous public contract and been terminated or sued. But how do I know if that happened? How can I tell whether I have the grounds to exclude somebody or not? Well, the answer is now you will go and look at the debarment list, amongst other things, and you will look at the exclusion information from the central digital platform. The debarment list is run by ministers, so it's dealt with at government level. And in the various bits of the legislation where you choose whether somebody is excluded or not, you can either make your own view or you can find that they are excluded or excludable by virtue of being listed on the debarment list. So if you, as a contracting authority, exclude a provider, so you disqualify them from your procurement partway through, or you don't let them join, you have to report that to the authorities, to the ministers, and there is then a process as to whether they consider there is a persistent problem that they think is going to affect future procurements in which this supplier might wish to be involved. And if they reach that conclusion, they will put the supplier on the debarment list. So those of you who work in education, you're already thinking barring list sounds a bit familiar. Sounds like the kind of thing that catastrophically ends a teacher's career if they get put on it. Yeah, does sound a lot like that, doesn't it? And potentially it's going to have that kind of effect. So there is, you will not be surprised, an extensive program of appeals and notices and waiting periods before anybody gets put on this list. But once they are on it, you are going to have to explain, particularly if they are listed as mandatory exclusion, why on earth did you award something to them if they were listed as being subject to mandatory exclusion. There are very, very limited circumstances in which you can do that. So be aware that listing possible exclusion grounds in the core supplier information is not the same as being on the debarment list. Because in the situation where the ministers assess that this isn't a recurrent problem that's going to exist in the future, they wouldn't put the supplier on the debarment list, even though something that's affecting them right now means they were excluded from one procurement, which has resulted in them being reported. Either way, it's still not good news, but not utterly fatal to being awarded contracts, particularly if you're on the excludable list, the discretionary exclusion, because discretionary exclusion remains discretionary, even if the person is on the list in that category. So what's actually new? We have new procurement procedures. Well, in fact, what we've got is a number of procurement procedures being put in the bin and not being replaced with anything else. So you will know, I am sure, but I'll run through it anyway just to remind you, there are 5 standardised procedures under the existing public contracts regulations: open, restricted, negotiated, competitive dialogue, and innovation partnership. The last one being so obscure that I've never done one. I'm not entirely sure anybody's ever done one. You didn't really get a lot other than the first 3. Under the new Procurement Act, there are only 2 procedures. There is the open procedure, which is like it is now, it is the one-step process. And then there is what is called the competitive flexible procedure, which is any other procedure at all that you can think up. And as Gemma was about to remind me, the government have very helpfully put up on the government website a sample competitive flexible procedure, which Gemma might want to say a word or two about, but I think it basically includes almost everything you might possibly ever want to include. And I think if you actually try to use the whole thing from front to end, it might be unnecessarily complicated because it might have different versions of the same thing in it. So you probably want to edit it down if you're going to use it. Is that a fair summary, boss?
I think that's absolutely a fair summary. There is some information out there, as Dan says, but it's extremely lengthy and there aren't any templates as such. It's more guidance and referring to the legislation. And like Dan says, it's round the block in length, I would say. So he's quite right in what he says there.
So the question is, any 2-step procedure or 3 or 4-step procedure is up to you to design. So it feels a little bit like if any of you have done a below threshold procurement, so what you would currently call Contracts Finder if you had to register on Contracts Finder, which you don't if you're a school. It's broadly do what the hell you want, provided it isn't obviously unfair or discriminatory between different bidders. So the only thing you have got is in Section 54, there are some basic time limits. So what you can't do, as you never could, is you can't throw out a new procurement and say, we want bids in 48 hours. Because that just gives a massive advantage to the people who know it's coming and absolutely no chance at all to the people who don't know it's coming. So there is a minimum waiting period you've still got to deal with. But beyond that, you can think up any procedure you want. So previously, if you wanted to go restricted, you could only do the things that were in that procedure. If you wanted to be able to talk about, so in restricted, you've never been able to negotiate the contract terms. You publish them at the start, they stay there, that's it. If you want to negotiate, there is the negotiated procedure or competitive procedure with negotiation, to give it its full name. And in that, you can negotiate about the terms of the contract, but other things aren't particularly flexible. You've got competitive dialogue, which is back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, best and final bids. So competitive dialogue is the one famously you use when you have a rough idea what you want, but you don't know how anybody's going to do it for you. And over at the open and restricted end of the process, that's about when you know what you want, you know the terms you want to buy it on, and you either want to whittle down to a short list by using restricted, or you just go for it on an open. So previously you had a defined choice and you had to use one of the procedures. Now you can write your own, which is great, provided you get it right and provided it's fair, but it does give you the ability to tailor it like you couldn't before. So, exciting question, when is a framework not a framework? And for anybody who is purchasing at the moment using a dynamic purchasing system, RIP dynamic purchasing systems, because you won't be able to award another one of those if you haven't already started by the time the rules change, because dynamic purchasing systems are not in the new legislation at all. There is a thing called dynamic markets, but I promise you they are absolutely not the same thing. We both, Gemma and I, looked at this extremely carefully, and they really are not the same. So if you want a DPS, get your skates on, because you haven't got very long to start. So what is open frameworks? Ordinary frameworks, I should say, will still exist. Your classic 4-year framework, like you know and love it, that's still going to be a thing. An open framework is a scheme of frameworks on similar terms where the appointment to the framework is reopened every few years. And there are some fiddly rules about how often you've got to do the first reopening and then how long again after that. But what it means is you can have essentially the same framework running for 8 years instead of 4. So if you want that long-term commitment and you know what you're looking for, you can set that running and then effectively refresh the framework at fixed points in the process. So unlike a DPS, where people could come in and out of it all the way through, with open frameworks, there's only so many points in the process when you reopen the list. And the reappointment rules depend. If you have unlimited number of providers, it's easier to stay on. If you have a fixed number of providers, you essentially have to make people rebid. Broadly speaking, but if you want to set up an open framework, please take detailed advice. Other advisors are available, but we do know about it. And there could be a great thing. We're coming to it at the end. Part of the flexibility is there's this new thing. Can you think of a situation where it will be better than what you do now? In which case, great, give it a try. Does it sound like something fancy that you'd never use? In which case, leave it where it is. Stick to what you know. Dynamic markets. So very clearly not a dynamic purchasing system. And the reason that is the case is under a DPS, you pre-qualify and then you go straight to the call-off stage. So there's pre-qualification and then one more stage. A dynamic market is only a way to shortlist the people who can be involved in a competitive flexible procedure. You'll remember from the previous slide, competitive flexible procedure has 2 or more stages. So there's number 1, get on the dynamic market, and then 2 or more further stages. So it's not a DPS and it doesn't work like a DPS. In fact, it's so unlike a DPS that it is clear that the creation of a dynamic market, and this is expressly set out in the new rules, is not a public contract in itself. So there are rules for operating dynamic markets, but merely creating the dynamic market does not put you in contract with anybody. So a dynamic market is basically a long list of preferred providers. Like a DPS, people can come and go from it at any time, so you can keep your list live. And once you've got your dynamic market, you can start your competitive flexible procedure, and only people within the dynamic market can bid in your competitive flexible procedure. So it's sort of like a pre-shortlisting filter, but it doesn't get you any closer to the terms of the contract itself. So what else is new? Well, hopefully a little visual cue at the top there. If you think about nothing else other than convertibles and modifications, then at least half of this slide will stick in your mind. What is a convertible contract? Because it's often been the question, what if a contract starts below the threshold and then increases in value over its lifetime? Under the old regulations, that contract was treated as below threshold for the whole of its life. A convertible contract, on the other hand, is one that increases in value during its life and so comes into scope of the Procurement Act and the procurement regulations. So you start below threshold, inflation kicks in or costs of performance creep up, variation clauses are exercised, and the contract value has risen. If that's the case, it has converted and it is now a covered procurement, and you should start applying the legislation to it. There is a wider ground for discretionary exclusion in Schedule 7, Para 12. This is quite good news if you've had contractors in the past who were quite rubbish, but not rubbish enough that you terminated the contract or sued them. Under the current rules, if you didn't terminate the contract or sue, then you can't discretionarily exclude that provider from the next procurement. Under the new rules, underperformance followed by a request for improvement followed by no improvement is a discretionary exclusion ground. So that will be interesting, because if it's a discretionary exclusion ground, then potentially it should be appearing on people's supplier information. It could, if somebody is excluded on that basis, result in them being on the debarment list, and so on. So persistent poor performance, and that potentially is going to get picked up on those performance reporting cycles, particularly if there's a breach giving rise to termination, because that's a specific reporting point in those notices. It's a little bit easier to modify contracts. Schedule 8 is the successor to our beloved Regulation 72, and paragraph 5 in that is new, so you've got a little bit more elbow room. Procurement assessments. Now, we'll talk about this because this and the next bullet go together. Historically, under the existing rules, you get to the end of the contract, you make an award, you write to all the losing bidders to start the standstill period, and in that letter you tell them how they did relative to the winner. Those letters start the standstill period, and at a later point you publish your award notice. That is not how it will be under the new rules. The first thing you have to do is issue procurement assessments to all the losing bidders. Then you publish an award notice, and the award notice starts the standstill period. So be aware of that. Don't be mistaken as to when your standstill period has finished. It only finishes the prescribed 8 working days from the time that you want it to be. So instead of 10 calendar days, it's changing to 10 working days. Most of the time that won't make a difference, because there's only the one weekend sitting in the middle to mess things up for you. But if you're running procurements over Christmas and New Year, that is going to make a significant difference to when the end of your standstill period falls. So don't accidentally go early. Do make sure that you're giving it the right amount of time. And notifiable below threshold contracts, that is the new name for things that go on Contracts Finder. Although, as we'll be talking about very shortly, some of you don't need to worry about that too much. In fact, let's go talk about that now. What about schools? I have had people ask me, can I confirm to them that schools are exempt from the Procurement Act and the procurement regulations? No, I can't, because they're not. So let's start with that. That is a myth, and we're going to lay that to rest straight away. You do get a slightly easier ride than all of my housing association clients and Gemma's local authority clients. So you can feel good about that, but it's not quite as much privileged treatment as you would want it to be. So the first question, and this is the sort of semantic nonsense that lawyers are absolutely famous for. Let's first decide, what do we actually mean when we say school? And the reason this is important is that if you notice paragraph D there, taken from section 123 of the Procurement Act, school includes an FE college. And I have read section 90 and 91 of the Further and Higher Education Act 1992, evidence herewith, and you can work your way through that, and basically FE colleges, FE corporations, sixth form colleges, etc. also count as schools. Next question I've received from a number of people, do universities count as schools? And, well, the starting point is, do you see universities in that list? Because there is no exemption for universities, so the only way to get within this is to be a school. And there's a reference there to an institution in the further education sector in section 91 of the 1992 Act. Further down section 91 is the definition of higher education sector, and that includes pretty much every version of describing a university that I can think of. So if the exemption applies to further but does not apply to higher, then if you are in the higher education sector, this exemption is not for you. I think the view being is there are so many more schools and FE colleges than there are universities, and they tend to be smaller in nature. I mean, certainly my daughter's primary school is about the size of the one in Postman Pat, and they've just about got in, well, they haven't even got enough resources to put out a netball team. They certainly haven't got the resources to be doing this kind of thing. So Yeah, if only they knew a good framework, maybe that could help them out. Perhaps that would be the solution for them. So if you are in this category of schools, good news for you. If you are not, then you are going to have to do pretty much the full compliance. So what is different? As I said at the outset, don't get overexcited here. This is not a get out of jail card. This is not a free pass. This is not an excuse from failing to do procurement. I have searched the legislation for the word school in order to find out the exemptions that apply to schools, and this is it. So the first four, as you will see, appear in a bit of a cluster, and they are all to do with the implied term that you will pay within 30 days, the requirement to publish notices regularly as a contracting authority to confirm whether you are paying within 30 days, 60 days or longer. So this is not to do with any performance of contractors. This is to do with your payment efficiency as a public body. So you do have to start publishing, if you're a contracting authority, regular reports every 6 months on how fast you are paying your contractors. So unfortunately, this isn't just publishing bad stuff about the providers. If you're getting behind with your payments, you have to name and shame yourself for that as well, but not if you're a school. Information about payments also not there, and implied 30-day payment terms forced into subcontracts also not there if you're schools. And the concept of the regulated below threshold contract does not apply to schools either. So that is the new incarnation of your existing exemption from having to register small contracts on Contracts Finder. So if it's above 30,000, but it is under the main threshold, if you're a school, you don't have to publish it. You are off the register in terms of that procurement. But that is, so far as I can determine, the extent of any favours that the new law is doing for you. So having said all of that, why do you care? Well, the number one thing is this. As you go through your cycle of procurement and contract management and termination and re-procurement, you are going to be washing your linen in public. Everybody's going to know. If you're having problems with the contractor, you're going to have to publish a notice saying that they're defaulting. Because while schools don't have to publish the payment performance notices, I haven't found yet an exemption to the KPI notices that you have to publish about contractor quality. Or contract termination notices. Still looks like you have to publish all of those. So in all of those circumstances, you have potentially got still to deal with this. So why are you concerned about it? Well, it doesn't just reflect on the provider. What goes in those notices potentially reflects on the contracting authority as well. If you're somebody who is regularly terminating contracts and having to publish termination notices, or regularly naming and shaming all your contractors for not meeting your very high KPI standards, anyone who gets on your framework or your contract is probably going to end up looking bad. So I would notice if you are a cluster of bad news for anybody who is a supplier of yours, I might think twice about whether I want to be a supplier of yours if I'm going to end up on that list. Because not everybody who looks at those notices is going to interrogate them very carefully. They might just say, oh, look, they don't have good performance on all their contracts. Maybe we won't invite them to bid on a contract where we get the choice. So be advised, you've got to publish all of these contracts. You've got to think about what's going in them and the impact it will have on contractors. And also think about the timescale. Because if you've got every 12 months and at the end of the contract, you have to do the KPI performance report, there's that pinch point in the year where you've got to make that assessment, apply the grading and publish it. So bear in mind that at the moment, contractors can only really argue with you about your assessment and award scoring and decide that you should have marked them higher. Now contractors have the ability to argue with how you've marked their KPI performance and to suggest that you've given them too low a grade and you've generally made them look bad. So at the moment, you have loads of focus on how do we apply the award criteria, what's the scoring matrix, where's the weighting, are there hidden criteria, and all of that stuff still goes on. I had to deal with an abandoned procurement only just before Christmas, where we had leading counsel advising on it. We had our client desperate to award the contract, but being threatened with litigation and having to drop it and make another plan because one of the bidders said, well, it wasn't obvious to me that you wanted me to talk about that because you didn't make it clear in the question. And our client's view was, it's surely it's implicit. How could you answer the question without talking about this? Unfortunately, the potential for misunderstanding had arisen, and that was enough to torpedo the procurement. Think about it now with a similar degree of rigor. How am I applying the KPIs? What are the criteria? Because you've got these gradings that you must apply. So in your KPIs, at the moment, you normally set pass-fail. Let's say, for example, I want this service provided within the relevant time scale 95% of the time. And anything under than that isn't good enough. Well, you've got 4 levels of performance to report. So maybe going forward, it would make more sense to say in the KPIs, this level of performance will put you in one of the 4 categories. Because then you're taking out any subjective suggestion as to how you've assessed it and the grades you've awarded. Because if you're repeatedly awarding bad grades, that is an argument to say that that provider is in persistent underperformance, and potentially you are creating grounds for a future contracting authority to exclude that bidder on a discretionary basis using the new exclusion ground that we talked about earlier in paragraph 12. So you can't just knock these notices out and forget about them. They are going to have consequences in the real world. So clearly, absolutely no presentation is complete without a Jean-Paul Sartre quote. So here it is. I can always choose, but I ought to know that if I do not choose, I am still choosing. You can practically smell the Gauloise, can't you? It's great stuff. So what's he saying there? Well, the answer is this. You have flexibility. You've got this new competitive flexible procedure, which can be whatever you want it to be. But if you decide, as is your choice, you're just going to replicate the old procedures from the 2015 regulations because you know and trust them, well, that's okay. But you can't then complain that they're too limiting and they didn't let you do what you wanted. You have got the ability now to write your own procedure if you really want to. So why would you? Well, certainly in the housing sector, there's a lot of user engagement. And if you're purchasing in the education sector, here's the terrifying prospect. Are you going to put any of these bids in front of the parents? Are you putting them in front of the governors? Are you putting them in front of a panel of pupils? Who knows? Maybe you would. I did a head teacher recruitment recently at the school where I'm a governor, and all the candidates had to go in front of the pupils because they were all very convincing in front of us governors that what are they like faced with a bunch of teenagers? And that was quite illuminating. So maybe you want user engagement that isn't built in at the moment. There is the ability, if you're doing competitive flexible under the new legislation, to refine your award criteria. So you can actually move the goalposts as you go along in a way that you could not do under the current rules, because it would invalidate your procurement partway through. So you can do that, but only if you've written in from the outset that you want to be able to do that. And you can't use that flexibility to change the rules in a way that people who were excluded at the start of the bid could in fact have been let in. So what you can't do is start with strict criteria and then soften them up when the only people left in turn out not to be able to do them properly. That's no different to softening the contract after the award, and that's still a problem. So, do you want to get involved in the exciting world of dynamic markets or open frameworks? Or maybe you're looking at the descriptions of those new ways of contracting, and you are thinking, that is exactly what I need. I've got, for example, quite a complicated requirement that I'm going to have over and over again. So I really need to know who's in the market, who's able to perform it, so I don't waste my time having to shortlist a load of unsuitable bidders. Well, that sounds like a case for a dynamic market. Establish your list of providers and then only talk to them, so long as it is properly dynamic and people can come and go from it. And open framework Maybe if you know what your framework's going to be and it really isn't going to change very much and you want to be able to run it for 8 years instead of 4, then open framework may be the one for you, provided you are comfortable with how you're going to reopen the framework, who gets to stay on, who might lose a place, how many people you want to be having as your framework providers, and you can apply those rules. Could be fine. All organisations have got risk management and assurance requirements. In my gubernatorial role, I should say, I am the chair of the Risk and Audit Committee. So those of you familiar with the Academy Handbook will know what an absolute world of pain it is to be on the Risk and Audit Committee. Everything's our problem. And I quite like the fact that there's the possibility here that we might be able to say to the Academy, when you're doing a procurement, just work through this checklist for me, please, so it doesn't come back to us later. And if you're using a competitive flexible procedure, there's no reason you can't write that into the process. It could be done. So if you've got particular things you need to be aware of, particular policies that you have, social value requirements, environmental standards, great. You could always put those into a procurement, but you could certainly put them into a competitive flexible, and you could certainly use refining the award criteria to maybe just tighten those up as we go, so only the people who can really meet the requirement get through to the end, as opposed to the people who talk a good game but don't give you anything. So that's a possibility. And think about resources. We've had to have this discussion with a number of our larger clients who have in-house procurement teams. Look at the number of notices you are having to publish. If you've got a lot of contracts on the go, you've got 6 monthly payment notices going out, you've got 12 monthly quality reporting going out, you've got interim breach reports if you have them, you've got contract change notices, you've got termination notices, and you've got all of the extra detail that has to go into all of the contract notices and award notices and all the other things you publish. There is a hell of a lot more admin going on behind this now. So in fairness, if you're thinking no problem, the finance officer or the school business manager is going to knock out the procurements like they used to do, this is a bit of a bigger job than it used to be. So if you get that particular function in your organisation coming to you and telling you that, or as is more likely with today's attendance list, you are performing that function, you have my permission to tell your governors or your funding body, whoever it may be, honestly, this is a lot harder than it used to be. And if they really want to know, make them sit through the recording of this, and then they'll know. And then they'll wish they'd agreed with you the first time. So there it is. That's the quick run through. So we have a little bit of time to take questions. I think we were booked for an hour, so we've got at least 9 to 10 minutes available. So colleagues at Dukefield, would we like to take some questions now? If there are any kicking about, feel free, anyone who wants to throw those into the text, or if there's a Q&A box, any of those things, please jump in, feel free. Alternatively, I think there might be, or the marketing team may be coming for me at this point. I may not have put our emails on the end of the slides.
Oh, no, I've noticed you haven't actually.
Oops. There you go. So you're too interested in the law, not interested enough in business development.
I'm sure we should have that afterwards, Dan. Don't
I was going to say that has stalked my career for 25 years, and I need to fix it. So yeah, we will. Yes, we'll send you the slides for circulation with another one on the back.
I can't see any questions at the moment in the chat or the Q&A.
Well, that said, once you get the slides, which will have some emails on the end, yeah, absolutely, we'll be sharing the slides, no problem at all. I assume on the basis this is being recorded and the transcription switched on, and we've got at least one person taking notes with Otter AI. There are multiple versions of this kicking about. Whether or not Otter knows to insert pause for laughter after any of my humorous asides remains to be seen. It may not be that good. But absolutely, if there are things at a later stage that you're trying to get to grips with as you come to terms with applying all of this, do feel free, give us a shout. We'll see what we can do. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Forbes, and thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.